Hello YouTube, I call myself Zondagskind and I am very excited about Civ VII being developed. So much so that Nystagmus from the Civ show and I organized a panel talk about one of the foundational changes in Civ VII, that you change civs in between eras. I was allowed to come on twitch.tv/thecivshow to lead a discussion with Rosenkreutz, who does cultural analysis of historical games on his YouTube channel, Paisley Trees, who gives you more of the historical context of Civ VI, and Sophie Quests, who does a variety of historical games over on her Twitch channel. As the only non-historian in between four historians, I just asked the questions. This panel was held on September 21 over on twitch.tv/thecivshow. Sorry for not bringing out the edit sooner, so if anyone does say something that is obsolete by now due to dev diaries or dev videos, then do please excuse us. I hope you enjoy. This era switching mechanic, what's the need for it?
I think this is just kind of my personal opinion based on everything I've heard from like all the releases so far, that they kind of started from a gameplay perspective and then kind of retroactively went more to the history after that. So I think the 3 Ages was mainly to try to solve the late game problem with Civ 6, which is a lot of people just don't want to play all the way to the end, because at some point in some games, especially if you're a single player, you've already won. You're just kind of going through the turns to get to the victory screen. And I think they kind of broke it up into these other bits to help with the gameplay aspect, and then kind of put the history in after that, in order to kind of have that historical progression. That's kind of like my takeaway from it so far.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. Right towards the end, we all talk about like the grind towards the end, where you've just like got this overpowered civ. You're just, just going through the turns. You're like, when is this gonna, like, when am I gonna like drop that bomb kind of thing? Like, drop the atomic bomb already. Let's end this now. I think that towards the end, there's not a lot of like kind of narrative events that I find that are really drawing me back in again and again, and like changing things up for me, like keeping it fresh. So when I saw the Civ 7 announcements, initially I was just like, yes, this is what we need to like keep it fresh, and keep the late stage game, like different things happening.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting balance for a game like Civ, because there is this double task of having gameplay that's smooth, but at the same time there is this claim to representing history that has some responsibility. And I think what we're seeing here is that when they implemented the whole idea of civ switching, if I'm not mistaken, it seems like it was feedback from the community to make it more historically sort of in line. And so it seems like this may have been something that our community wants to see as well. So, I mean, of course, we like to play and have fun, but a lot of us are interested in how do we represent the past? How do we gamify it? And these are the sort of things that I hope we talk about today, even though I think we all recognize it's a game, and probably a game first. And then secondly, there's this claim to representing history, and how is that done? That's what interests me. Did you want to add something?
Yeah, one thing I was thinking about is, there's really 2 big changes happening here, which is the much increased focus on ages and the much more focus on ruptures between ages, and then the civ switching mechanic. And I think if it had been just one or the other, people might have said, oh, okay, it's a slight change, but it's not a huge deal. But I think having both of them at the same time really restructures the game.
Do you see kind of a parallel between how Paradox is changing focus to how Firaxis seems to be changing focus here?
In some ways, like, for sure, because there's definitely an approach of like, I mean, they do recognize these are games first, history second, but there is this kind of innate feeling that like when they make these games, these are people who like history and they want to in some way like represent it or like do justice to it. And I think that with the age switches, what they've done is introduced a new element to which they can kind of be not necessarily like faithful to history in the way that it'll be like railroaded, but that like it's demonstrating more of history. Like, for example, classically, you're never going to think of a Civ game without like the Romans, but you never see a Civ game with the Italians. And I think that this is something that, like, you know, having the eras lets Italy be in the game, for example.
Definitely, because like I feel like this change is more representative of yeah, our history and also the people that play it. Like if I people are made up from all different cultures and backgrounds, and when we play Civ, we choose Civs that we align with, whether it's like, oh, you know, my family is from Rome or like Italy, and I'm gonna go play Rome or I'm gonna play Sweden. But with this itself, like you get even closer to that, where you can express yourself through history and the cultures. And I find that this is like they're bringing it closer to history, because we all know that history is just layers upon layers of different people, communities, and I find that this expression, I find it works. It's when the ages comes in, interacting with that, where it becomes a little bit muddly.
Yeah, I guess I'll jump in and say I've seen a lot of people in like Civ Fanatics forum and in other places comment. Polish people especially, I've seen say I play Civ to play Poland. And I think on the flip side is now, when will Polish people be able to play Poland? Because I'm not sure that, you know, this kind of mechanic will work for every community if they're not going to have all three parts represented. And I think that's going to obviously be coming with a lot of DLC, but from the beginning, there's going to probably be a lot of dissatisfied fans who play Civ to take their community from the beginning to end, even if it is, you know, ahistorical, or kind of like you know, reimagining history. So I think, although from my perspective, when I play Civ, I like, for example, I love playing the Ottomans because I love Ottoman history. But when I am playing from the ancient era, I'm just like, I'm just gonna pretend like this isn't the ancient era. Or I always wished I could play Byzantium into the Ottomans. That would have been really fun. So there's a lot of benefits and a lot of fun sort of additions that come with it, but so many challenges that Firaxis is setting up for themselves. And I think there's a lot of disappointed fans from certain areas. It's possible to see, and especially because the changes of some civilizations comes with a lot of brutality, and like maybe you don't want to think about how Byzantium was conquered. But I mean, that's maybe not the best example. There's other better examples like the Shawnee, which are still a nation today, and in the exploration age, when they become a different civ in the modern age, what are they implying there, right?
Sorry. One thing that could happen is, because they're doing this age system, they can actually have more civs in the game, that it may not make as much sense to try to balance the game for a bunch of civs that existed in antiquity and then all the way through the modern era, because that was the other problem that happened. A lot of civs would just power spike at a certain time, and then after that they all became the same, which kind of didn't allow them to have their unique characteristics move forward. But now with the age system, you can play as, like, say, the Hittites, and then transition to another civ, and then they also have their unique unit, and then it allows you to have that feeling of uniqueness for each civ and each age that will carry throughout the entire game, as opposed to like one part of it.
If America, for example, had, like, you know, some like ancient era unique unit, that would be bizarre, right? So like it makes sense that they're a late game thing, but then that also means that you kind of have to think about, like, well, I'm just sitting here playing a generic civ for a really long time, and then, oh, now I finally get my ability. Replacing that with actually having like a unique at every phase sort of means that I think honestly it means that like more of them will feel playable, or like you won't feel like, well, I'm just playing this one and waiting for forever until I feel like I'm really playing it. I think that has a lot of opportunity with it to also mean that you can, like, for example, just throw in a lot more ancient era ones that have existed in the older games and been gotten rid of because they don't want to, you know, like, overpack it with like ancient civs or something, but we all sort of know them and think of them as kind of famous, and then when they disappear, like the Hittites did, I think the last time they were in one was 3, maybe 4.
Yeah, it was in 3, I
Like,
think. Yeah.
Yeah, like when that happens, it's not like you're like, oh no, Hittites devastated, Hittite fandom ruined. Like, but you do feel like something disappears every time a Civ disappears from this. And with this style of roster, I feel like they can just expand it.
That brings us nicely to the 3 ages that Civ has that Firaxis has chosen now for Civ 7. So there are 3 ages: Antiquity, the Age of Exploration, and the Modern Age. And the Exploration Age, maybe for me as a European, that kind of rang like, okay, that's 1400 to 1700. But from what I understand, it's actually in Civ 7 a much like earlier time frame, something like between 500 and 1500 CE, thereabouts. Paisley, I wanted to go straight to you because you already made a video on those 3 ages and how it actually does reflect a kind of recent academic debate on how to see this age of exploration. So could you talk about that?
Yes, so we know from screenshots that the beginning is 400, and when I saw that, I was very confused actually, because I think there's a common knowledge understanding, which is the one you're talking about, Zon, that the exploration age is tied to Magellan, the Spanish, the Portuguese exploration. But there is this new book that we've talked about, but also in the field of history, this idea of that the year 1000 is the beginning of the age of globalization. And did you want to talk about it?
Yeah, I mean, it's a controversial thesis. It's definitely not one that is universally accepted. But it's making a bold claim, which is that, at the year 1000, you finally have a kind of global connectivity. So whether that is an object like a coin or a microbe or, a political idea, concept, you could theoretically have it cross the world at that point. So,
And the examples we gave in our video was the exploration of Polynesia.
In the Norse and exploration of Madagascar, just kind of areas where all the kind of previously unexplored areas of the world are being encountered by people for the first time.
And we know Dr. Johnson, the senior historian, tweeted about this video, and he said, we have to take into consideration what does exploration mean for every corner of the world. So this is maybe why we're seeing not the common knowledge idea of exploration, but I'm thinking it will be around 1600 or 1700 the end, or the years between 1500 to 1600 will be the crisis age. For that period, we don't know the end date. We just know that the Mughals are the latest civ in exploration age.
Yeah. Like you said, like the
I'm sorry, in the modern age. Mughals are in
Right.
the modern age.
Yeah.
That makes me feel like it's going to be around like 1750, somewhere around there, like 1700 something.
Wasn't quite. This might be the deepest cut and the least serious question on my list. What would John Baggett's Glub have made of this 3-era system?
Honestly, he might have kind of liked it in that anytime you make like a condensed age system, you can really sort of define a civilization that existed within that moment. I think what the era system's done here is, from a gameplay perspective, it's kind of like what they've done is they've taken ancient and classical and grouped those together, and then medieval and Renaissance or early modern and grouped those together, and then the rest of it and grouped those together. And what that kind of does in terms of gameplay is it does sort of, I'll put it this way: humankind, you can choose to kind of prestige as the same civ you already were, but with the system that they're handing us, it seems like you kind of have to like transcend into a different thing. And that sort of implies either like an organic transformation, as with the Indian civs that have like an organic progression, or it means that like you kind of stop being what you are. And I think that that's something that Glub would probably say is exactly part of his theory.
Speaking of the eras, the names for them, are they better than the ones in Civ 6? Because the Civ 6 one has, for example, the Renaissance, which is, as far as I understand, like a purely European understanding of that time.
There is
I-
a new field of global Renaissance studies, trying to connect these early modern empires together. So, for example, the argument can be that the Safavids are part of this Renaissance. You can look up global Renaissance. I think it's a book title, actually.
Yeah, I mean, almost all these terms have been kind of put into a global frame. So people say global enlightenment, global baroque, global
Global
renaissance.
Baroque, yes.
But again, it's controversial because let's say I'm an Ottomanist, maybe I am. You know, the term baroque, there's buildings in Istanbul that look extremely baroque, but they never use that term. So in that sense, how can you say, okay, this is part of this baroque?
Yeah, and I think this is the problem. The terms come from a Eurocentric view, and now in history, they're being sort of adopted and adapted for non-Eurocentric tellings of history. But the problem remains is, where did these words come from? What is framing them? So I think
Yeah.
antiquity, exploration, and modern all have that problem, that they originate from a Eurocentric view, but can they be adapted for a global one? And I think that's what they want to do. I don't think they mean it in a Eurocentric way.
No,
I
I
would say
don't.
these are a lot more neutral, which
Yeah.
not necessarily that they pass on being fully neutral. Like obviously, exploration is, as we've just mentioned before, you have to ask exploration of what by who. What does that mean? Because like it could kind of mean, you know, the era where the Srivijaya kingdom started to expand across what is now Indonesia and like Java and stuff. But does it? We don't really know.
There's a lot that we don't know about, like, what is being included in these, like, eras, what they're considering to be what is exploration. But I think just generally from a gameplay perspective, it's there. I find that Civ are really leaning into a more narrative kind of experience, and so the and what Paisley, going off Paisley, was saying is that we're using these like the identifying time with these names like Renaissance, everything, from a more academic kind of perspective, because we're trying to understand history. We're trying to like make it more palatable for people to grasp history. So as like a gamer coming into Civ, you're getting the exploration age. You're kind of getting a prompt to like what is expected in that narrative kind of area of the game. And I'm not saying that like there's some negatives there, that there's some issues that could arise from that. And I think one thing that comes from identifying these periods of time is that there's always going to be outliers. There's always going to be a country or a people, a civilization that will be an outlier to that, especially when it comes from a very Eurocentric perspective, which is probably where we're all kind of feeling a bit irksome about this game. But I can see with the identification of different eras, it's more narrative based for Civilization. They themselves have said that they have like 1,000 different like narrative events coming into the game now. So I just think that yeah, that's what I'm a bit more positive. I think I'm definitely leaning into a more positive kind of like hopeful thing. I think that leaning into the narrative aspect is very exciting to me.
There's this assumption, for example, the Aztecs have in Civ 6 an ancient era unique unit, when they don't belong in the ancient era. They're actually contemporaneous with like Florence, like the Medici Florence. And I think there's this kind of responsibility that they have. They're not trying to teach history, but they shouldn't be like players shouldn't walk away knowing something that is wrong, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
When
Yeah.
Gandhi nukes the world, we know that's not historically accurate. But do we know that the Aztecs are not an ancient era Civ?
Yeah, that's true. That's the stuff that is problematic for players to walk away with that kind of knowledge. And like, because if you're coming from a Eurocentric kind of frame, and then you're making small changes like that, where you might think that it's like we'll put them in the antiquity, but it is actually forming people's like ideas about this civilization. And this is going to happen for a lot of like indigenous nations in the game, is like, where do you put them, and what is considered like progress with an indigenous nation? Like, why wouldn't they be in the modern age? Why can't an indigenous nation start in the modern age? It's not necessarily like, it's based off technology, but like, what necessarily makes that their technology, their knowledge any different from America or like, yeah, Australia?
And on that point
yeah.
about different like technologies and where to put them, I think in Civ 7 there was a movement in the right direction, because I think that some of the civs have their own tech trees. Like there's not like a single tech tree for everybody. And so there's different tech trees, there's different civics, and so they are becoming more focused on specific civs and their own unique attributes that they have that they can bring to the table.
That I'm excited about.
The way that crises kind of divide those eras, like again, for me as a European, this makes sense, because we kind of think of, okay, the fall of Rome, between quotation marks, that kind of starts the medieval era. Then either the fall of Byzantium or the religion wars, or the discovery of America, that starts the Renaissance. But this idea of there's a crisis and then a new era starts, there's this kind of watershed moment. Is that something that's true for a global perspective?
Well, not at all at the same time, but
Yeah.
I think you and I disagreed about this. You said it kind of makes sense, right?
I mean, it depends on what they define as the crisis, right? I mean, there are things like pandemics that do affect the world, right?
At certain points.
At certain points. But it's tough when you're, it's tough because, again, like the examples they were giving were like the barbarian invasions, so-called barbarian invasions. And again, that is a kind of Eurocentric idea of this is the crisis of the antiquity, right? So, yeah, I don't know, it depends on how the crises work, I suppose.
Yeah, I guess as we become more globalized, the crises become global. So it's an easier time from exploration to modern to think of something that probably did affect most of the world, but harder at the beginning.
What I would be interested in seeing is if whether or not the other players that you're playing with in the game create stronger connections. So the example I would give as like a crisis that, it won't be in the game because it's before antiquity, but the Bronze Age collapse, which one of the theories behind the Bronze Age collapse is the systems collapse theory, in which they were so interconnected with each other that when one underwent some sort of disaster, it would affect all of the other empires in the system. And it kind of is almost like a global system, even though it was only in the Eastern Mediterranean. But how, something that a far away world away, like all the way to the other end of the world, can affect us, I think it would be very interesting.
That's not gonna be a uniform thing, and I don't think there ever can be like a uniform global event. But I mean, it's a game first, history second, and it's in that way probably going to fit closer to like the way that people try and make a lot of things from the West analogous to China. When we talk about like empires and emperors and the dynasties and how those turn and sort of compare those structurally and kind of go, oh, that's kind of like when this happened over here, or like that guy's kind of like what we would call a king. Like all of those comparisons, those conflations are sort of required by a game like this, unless they want to get like really detailed with it, which would take so much effort.
The other thing I'm kind of starting to see is, because they haven't said it's going to be a global crisis yet. Like, I don't know how it's going to exactly. There's going to be levels. There's going to be 3 levels of crisis. And imagine being in a multiplayer game where every player undergoes their own crisis. And it's not like the same one. And I'm starting to wonder if like a lot of the game modes that they've been putting into Civ 6 were like soft launches for these themes in Civ 7. Like the Dramatic Ages mode is like a theme for like a crisis at the end of an era, because you can go into a dark era and like you lose half your cities.
In terms of the civ switching, but maybe also in how that is dictated by narrative.
Like, I mean, I've been telling you guys I'm so excited this whole time. But yeah, just like the expression of gameplay is really exciting to me. And through the narrative, and it sounds like the team have really lent into the narrative experience with this, and then just the layering of history. I'm super excited to see that. And just player choice is really important. So I guess like specifically though, what I would want to do is to combine the combination of different cultures that may never have really like been able to combine in history. Like just seeing how that expresses itself is going to be so crazy. And hopefully we can do that. I know that they've pre-selected civilizations, but fingers crossed, like, because like it's a bit blurry around that, whether we can just like, okay, here are some suggested civilizations, but also you can just go and do whatever the heck you want and just create some monstrosity of the past. So I think that's what I am very excited for. That is basically what I'm looking forward to in the game.
So again, to compare it to Humankind, sorry, there's a big feeling that I sort of saw looking at that game, and when I made a video kind of comparing them, where people were sort of talking about how ungrounded it was and how that felt like it hurt their sense of immersion, for lack of a better term. And I do understand where that comes from. I really get it. I think that Humankind's system of being completely unbound means that it's really interesting for like builds and mechanically thinking about how to like kind of break the game almost. But I feel like having some grounding or like gameplay that you have to do, or like an incentive or like an accomplishment you have to have in order to unlock the other options, is a really good way to do it. And they have that example with the one chart where Hatshepsut can become the Mongolians if she has access to enough horses. I think that that's a really good way to like let you play with the system while not necessarily meaning that the AI will always kind of quote unquote break down from the path.
And correct me if I'm wrong, the Ed Beach said this sort of historical path was something that came up, or they developed later after they came up with civ switching. So they already had this idea of civ switching, and it would be open for all, or it would be through the unlock path. And the feedback they got from the civ community is they want historical paths. So I think that really opens them up to a lot of critiques. And once we get into the examples we've seen, they are some of them just make absolutely no sense to me. And so I think what I'd like to see in Civ 7 is for every path that they've connected, they give us a little blurb in their Civlopedia for the nerds like us to be like, what connects these two exactly? What are you looking at here? And so, yeah, I think without enough civs, it really breaks down for me.
And then from a gameplay perspective, the civ switching and also having certain resources to let you switch makes a lot of sense, because, you know, it's really not fun if you're Age of Steam Victoria and then you don't have any coal in the later game, right? And so it lets geography kind of determine some of the choices you have, which is kind of cool. So I'm really interested in seeing how they implement that.
I think it's also a really organic determinism in a way, because like, okay, say you're living your hypothetical dream of like, oh yeah, I'm playing as the ancient Greeks, and then what would it take for me to become a steppe nomad culture? Oh, we've built a culture around horses, and that just sort of organically feels like it could happen in a way. It doesn't mean that you're the real world Mongolians per se, but like that you had the potential to take the path that they did. I think that that's actually like a pretty, I don't know, it's a fun way to think about it. You know, it doesn't feel like it grates for me.
And I like how it's in the player's hands, but I saw someone mention on Reddit how, you know, like having 3 horses wouldn't make you Mongolia. So it also like taking sort of simple mechanics. Yeah, I mean, it takes a lot of imagination on our ends to sort of make those connections.
Okay, 5.
Yeah, like as soon as you say there's a connection, like if you say, here's your historical choice, you're now making an authoritative statement, right? This is an authoritative statement that this choice is more historically accurate.
Yeah, and people, I've read comments where people say, well, you can play, as you mentioned, Gandhi nuking people and all this kind of stuff. But at the same time, even in the earlier Civ games, you kind of expected a certain correspondence in the sense that, let's say you have a Canada Civ, you imagine it's not going to be like this incredibly warlike, imperialistic Civ that's going to, conquer everyone in the ancient age, right? There's a kind of sense of what Canada is going to be like in the game. So there's always been that kind of claim to history, but now it's being more explicit.
Now they're literally saying historical choice. I think they changed it in the new developer video. They changed it to I think it was regional choice, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
I've seen the words
Yeah, I
historical
think
and
they're-
immersive used in.
Yeah, they're changing it to like geographic choice. I think something like along those lines.
Mm-hmm.
So you have these paths, and like we said, for a region like India, that makes a lot of sense. For a region like Persia, Iran, that makes a lot of sense. But let's say that the Maori are added as an exploration age civ. That does make a lot of sense. What civ would you put in front of them, and what civ would you put after them?
This is the issue, right? Is that
Yeah.
by making that kind of transition, even if you are talking about layered history, it does sort of imply an end, right? And the issue is that with indigenous peoples around the world, if you put them in
Maori to
exploration
New
age,
Zealand.
right? It's making a claim that the Maori civilization is over and now it's New Zealand, right? And so you end up with that, again, that kind of explicit claim that there's a kind of end to that history. And
I think they're trying to avoid this by talking about layered history, that New Zealand today is Maori history too. And they're doing this through architecture, through keeping your sort of civ tree, you keep your bonuses. The only way they have to communicate this is through gameplay design, and that might not be enough. It may still fall short of sort of
Absolutely.
showing that Maori are not taken over by New Zealand, because that's both untrue and also not something I want to do when I'm playing Civ.
Now, and of course, it's really complex because you have this limitation in Civ of you have one tag per player. Like, at least in Victoria 3 or like the Paradox games, you can split off tags, you can convert tags. But in Civ, you have this problem of one tag per player. I've been waiting for this one. I want to hear about the Shawnee from Paisley.
Actually, the one the Ghost enthusiast has mentioned is the one that's really getting me a little upset. I know I'm trying to be positive about Civ 7 because I'm excited to play it, but the question of, Aksum to Songhai to Buganda, this is why I'm asking Civ developers to put in the Civlopedia what they think connects these, because to me there's no really historical connection, and to say there's a regional connection between Songhai and Buganda, which is further than Songhai to Poland, also seems really too loose for me. So the only conclusion I've seen that I can come up with, and others I've looked in forums, I've tried researching it, is that they're both in Africa, and that's just such an unfortunate trope to sort of combine all African civs together.
Yeah, and with the Shawnee example, again, the issue is that we don't know what's coming in the modern age. So, it's difficult because I would prefer indigenous civs to not kind of have that kind of boundary, but again, we'll see what happens. But if it ends up being that it's just the Shawnee into the United States, again, you're in that situation where you're sort of implying that there's a necessary historical progression from indigeneity to colonial domination, right? And in the case of, let's say you have give an example like the Cree going into Canada, for instance. In Civ 6, you were able to have those as separate civs, each fleshed out, each able to be contemporaneous. But in this case, not only are you having the Cree end in one era, but you're explicitly kind of replacing them with a state that tried to wipe out their culture, right? And so it makes a really tricky ground for the game to cover.
And maybe they'll have a solution. We don't know yet.
Yeah. Hopefully they do, because we know that indigenous nations, the colonization is still ongoing today. And it's expressed through nationalism as well. and I would like to see with indigenous nations in the game. Yeah, I think that if there was more involvement in the modern era, because in Australia, for example, we have a lot of like bushfire issues, and like we have a lot of issues with the land, like as the Western occupant. But now we're leaning into indigenous knowledge of the land, of the climate, of the seasons and everything. So we're leaning into a technology that they've had for thousands and thousands of years. So I don't know if there's a way of expressing that in the game, but like with crises like climate change, and that I feel like that's where indigenous nations could really be used in the gameplay, because, and like in diplomacy and politics, like I think that we could incorporate stuff like that instead of just like completely replacing them with the colonizer.
Well, there's two sides to it. One is that like in my ideal world, almost all of them would get the India treatment. So like for example, there would be, you know, like the ancient and then the like exploration and then the modern for each of them. And so I don't know, this is going to be a bad one because the Hittites are not actually Turkic or whatever, but if the Hittites and then into the Ottomans into modern Turkey, that would kind of work. But like obviously it's not perfect. But then when you start to introduce the idea of, you know, settler states, modern contemporary settler state nations, because you can't ignore them in a game like this. You can't just have a Civ game without America. That would be weird. You kind of run into the question, right? Like, who were they before? Are they going to be European every single time? Because either option kind of seems weird and uncomfortable.
I wonder.
That's where you really, sorry, that's where you really run into the issue of it's one tag per player. Like, obviously, they are really an amalgamation. It's not the best word for it, but English people and French people and Dutch people and Swedish people and people native to North America met, and that became America, and you know, many other people as well. But it didn't come from one people. It's kind of and this is kind of the tag I had above this conversation. How can you express in a video game this web of cultures converging and diverging when in the game you have one tag per player, and you can conquer an entire other civ, but other than that, it's kind of immutable that you have this one tag per player. And that, especially with settler colonial states like Australia, America, Canada, that's not just a can of worms, it's like the whole garden.
Yeah, and I think there is other examples that I've seen come up, like Assyria being sort of also a contemporaneous issue with the Assyrian communities. Are they going to just become a Muslim community, like taken over by a Muslim empire? So it's also, there are other instances where this could be a little tricky. But again, we don't know. They may have a solution. They probably thought about this and have a solution.
Another one that didn't make sense to me, and I mean, when you're talking about European civs, it's far less harm done, but sometimes it's still weird. Like Rome to Normans. I could name like 16 different civs that have more of a claim to being the successors of Rome.
I think Rome is whack for that reason, though, because it's about it falling apart and everyone saying that they're the inheritor of it.
Yeah.
You know, from anyone ranging from the Ottomans to the Russians to Norway by one claim through Thrace. Like everyone has some sort of like we were Rome in some way, and so because Civ can't ever demonstrate something, if nothing falls apart in Civ. And so because of that, you can't have a lot of people all simultaneously claiming Rome. In theory, a player could possibly, you know, go from Rome to other things and in that way represent it, but it's kind of funny to choose like a true successor to Rome and then it's the Normans of all people, especially considering that they're, you know, kind of a confluence of Anglo-Saxon English who then are and like all, I don't know.
Yeah, Byzantinists right now must be livid. But also, I was thinking maybe Rome special ability can be they turn into all other civs. And
Well, I mean, this is
Yeah,
what
they just have an open book.
yeah.
this is what I was thinking when you mentioned the Hittite to Ottoman to Turkey example is also, they're relying on a lot of nationalist narratives to make these
Yeah.
claims. And that's also a really tricky thing because we can see how history is layered, but a lot of times layers are made up.
Yeah, like around
Yeah.
Istanbul, there's these suburbs that are named after all the civilizations that supposedly went into Turkey. So you have like there's Hittites, Sumerians, Akkadians, and it's like this is just a claim. Like it doesn't really make any sense, right?
Right.
Yeah, we
lot
don't
of
need to
these
give Sun Theory people.
Yeah.
And like Egypt is a great example because it's kind of an uncomfortable one in terms of like indigeneity in a way that we don't tend to think about. Like, because the Copts still exist, but the Copts aren't actually like, I mean, linguistically they have some threads that connect back to Kemetic languages, but then Kemetic is a word that we kind of made up anyway also, and like the people who live there now are Egyptian, but the word Egypt means like 3 different things at different times.
I do think like the entire concept from the get-go is very ambitious, but it's just wrought with a lot of, because you have to make choices, right? When they're saying that one civ has to move into another, you're now making a choice. And like I said, whenever you make these choices, it becomes authoritative, especially if you call it like a historical connection. And I don't envy Dr. Johnson, who's the senior historian for them trying to make these connections. And so I'm cautiously optimistic that that they're going to do it correctly, but I do see the minefield they are trying to walk through right now.
And like Paisley is right on the money with like just like draw a little picture for us. Like what is connecting these two civs for us? Like, and then that kind of like holds our hand as someone that doesn't know anything about history or does. Like it holds the player's hand and guides them to the next stage and make sure that we're not like thinking, oh, this is the natural progression for this civilization. Yeah, if they could do that, I mean, I'm always open in the encyclopedia in games, like, but if they can bring it more forward into that transition, like, and they kind of have done that, like where they like do those little cut scenes and stuff, like, yeah, that would be great.
I agree. I would like to see that too as you're making those choices, because it is kind of like again, we talked about gamification of like historiography, right? And so I think I saw in Paisley Tree's one of your videos mentioning it's also an opportunity to maybe correct a couple of misconceptions, right? So America, for example, a lot of people would assume that America's current democracy is highly influenced by the Roman Republic, but that's not actually true. They took a lot of ideas from the indigenous people who were there and adapted them for their own democracy that they had after they had the revolution, specifically I think from the Iroquois. And so there's a way of like maybe connecting that, but I don't know how they can do that correctly without it being wrought with a lot of problematic attributes.
I feel like Egypt was just one of the most like uncomfortable ones they could have slapped on the table first. Like if they had done it with the 3 India civs that they have, people would have been like, oh cool, that makes perfect sense. But then they might have the expectation that everyone gets that full treatment, and that's that would be its own problem. But at least people would look at the game and go, wow, that's interesting, instead of going, hey, does anyone else see this? Because this I'm getting some vibes here that I don't know how to feel about.
Maybe Civ are testing us. They're like putting it out there. They're like, okay, we have an issue. We need you guys to talk about this. Let's sort it out now because we don't want to deal with it later. Let's fix it now, kind of thing.
Or just fishing, see if anyone cared, and if it was completely silent, they were like, okay, cool, ship it.
Okay, yeah.
That's why it's so contentious, is like how much freedom does the player still have when our choices are being limited. I'm excited to see if you can. I mean, playing Tecumseh as sort of like an American leader can be fun. That's one choice we're still given.
Yeah, and I think in terms of the game mechanics too, like we've learned that for Exploration Age, they're opening up another part of the map to kind of encourage you to do overseas exploration. And again, it's one of those things where, okay, it could be interesting, but also, again, it's kind of very fraught because then you're, again, it kind of
Limits you.
limiting the player, but also forcing them into a mode of gameplay that
Yeah.
is also, has historical problems, right?
That's
Which
true.
I think Ed Beach literally talked about as this, like the Spanish exploration is why we're expanding the map. And I don't know why he said that.
Rosenkreuz, you made a video where you compared Humankind and Civ 6. And you mentioned that in Humankind it feels a lot more like you're rolling with the punches, whereas in Civ 6 you're planning something out and re-rolling if it doesn't work. What do you think Civ 7 will feel more like, rolling with the punches or planning and re-rolling? And do you feel about that positively or negatively?
Ooh, I feel like it could go, or that the option exists for both, in that I can see people getting like really into the meta of building their ideal combinations of like, okay, first I got to start out as this civ and then I become this one. I mean, because unfortunately that was one of the downsides Humankind had, was that there was like people basically found out like their 3 optimal paths, and they would just hope to God that they could transition into those exact civs at that exact time to hit all the people who were like at their peak at the right time. And I feel like since this is a limited system, it doesn't encourage that as much, but it still encourages a bit of play. While also just, I mean, they have emphasized the fact that like, oh, you can be cultural now, and so like maybe if the whole warfare thing genuinely isn't working out with you, sorry, you're not stuck as the Huns being like, great, my ability to just raise cities slightly faster is really helping me now. And I think that's good. I think that that'll keep people like, not feeling like they have to re-roll like halfway through a campaign or whatever.
Great, and for everyone else, like, I think on balance we're still super stoked for this game. So,
Yes,
Strategy.
definitely so.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, still excited. It's I think one of the sayings is it's always okay to be really excited for a piece of media, but also be in a position to critique it in a way that's constructive.
I mean, that means you like it.
Yeah, and especially I played Humankind 2 weeks ago. I'm excited for Civ 7.
I'm really excited about Navigable Rivers.
Oh yeah.
Can't wait.
all we want is navigable rivers.
They're so neglected in games like this.
So, that was the end of this Civ 7 talk. I hope you liked it. If you did, then do please leave a like, and make sure to follow all the people that were in the talk: The Civ Show, Rosenkreuz, Paisley Trees, and Sophie Quests. If you want to leave a comment, then please do that down below. And in any case, you can subscribe and ding the bell so you know when my next video goes live. And we will see you then. Bye bye.